David here with Figboot on Pens, back again with another fountain pen review. Today, I have for you something that if you've seen a lot of fountain pen social media, you will have seen a lot of over the last couple of days. It is a brand new pen from Esterbrook, and that would be a modern version of their Model J, which is called the JR. What I'm going to do today is go over the parts and features of the Esterbrook JR, talk about what I care for and what I don't care for. I'll show some measurements, size comparisons, and provide a writing sample. Thanks go out to Kenro Industries, the owners as well as distributors of the Esterbrook line, for providing this pen on loan for review. As I mentioned, Esterbrook JR is a modern reimagining of the vintage Esterbrook J, which was produced from 1948 until I believe like the late 1960s. Mine arrived in this bag, and inside the bag there is a box tied with a string. And once you get this string off, inside we have a fabric box. And inside the fabric box, there is a couple of things. There is a cartridge. Then there is also a polishing cloth. And then we have a pen. This is the Esterbrook JR. Mirroring the production of the original J's, it is available in 3 different colors. There is the Carmine Red, Tuxedo Charcoal, and the Capri Blue. Now, here are the newer models alongside their vintage counterparts. There are a number of differences between the vintage and modern models, and I'll discuss those differences here in a bit. And the version I have here is the Carmine Red. It's a fairly small pocket pen, as was the original J. It is made from a turned acrylic. I really like that the material has some subdued swirls and subtle color variation. I think it looks nicer than if it was just a solid red. On the top of the cap, it is inlaid with a metal piece containing the Esterbrook Eternity symbol. Now, Esterbrook's marketing says that this symbol is 2 interlocking E's, and for the life of me, I just wasn't seeing how this could be 2 E's, but then I finally figured it out. So here's a challenge for you. If you wanted to pause this video and take a good look at this symbol and draw out how you feel this is 2 E's, then during the writing sample, I'll show you the solution that I came up with, and we can see if yours matched mine. So then we have the clip. It's fairly similar in design to the vintage model, but this clip is actually longer. And on the original, it's actually stamped with the company name. The cap angles up slightly, and at the end, there is a band engraved with the Esterbrook name. There is a decent sized step down to the barrel, which is straight, until you get to this silver colored band where it tapers down a bit to the end of the barrel, which is silver metal. The cap unscrews in 2 full rotations, and underneath we have a stainless steel number 5 Yovo nib. The nib will be available in extra fine, fine, and medium. The red and black models have nibs which are rhodium plated, and the blue model's nib is gold plated. And here's a look at the plastic feed. I find the fine nib on this specific pen to be rather stiff. It does have a fair amount of feedback as well. Not scratchiness, but feedback as opposed to glassy smoothness. The section begins with this concave portion and then straightens out before it reaches the threads and a small step up to the barrel. Now, I've said this many times before, but I have a tendency to grip my pens close to the end of the section, so this section really doesn't pose many issues for me. But I noticed that this design does have a tendency to kind of force your grip into this one particular portion. If you grip your sections a bit farther back, you might find that grip traveling forward a bit as you write. If you do grip the pen far back, then if your hand rests on the threads, I don't find them to be sharp or uncomfortable. I find the JR plenty long enough to use unposted. The cap does post, and it does post securely. It's light enough that I don't find it backweights the pen or throws off the balance. While the step up from the barrel to the cap is rather steep, it's rounded so it's not sharp, and I find it comfortable against my hand. Now, I'm not quite sure about the design element of this band here in the back. When capped, it kind of has this dual band look, but when uncapped, it almost looks like an elongated piston knob. I don't dislike it, but it just wasn't one of my favorite elements of this pen. As opposed to the original J, which was a lever filler, this one is a cartridge converter pen. It accepts standard international cartridges, one of which is included, as well as an Esterbrook branded converter. Since there are metal elements in the section and the barrel, this one would not be recommended in order to eyedropper. Personally, I have not been bitten by the vintage bug. I own a couple, but for the most part, they just don't excite me as much as modern pens. There's nothing wrong with vintage, in my opinion. It's just not my thing. I do own a vintage Esterbrook J that you'll see here in a bit, but I will admit it doesn't get much use. I made it a point to reach out to a couple of different vintage Esterbrook aficionados, and their opinions were mixed. Some felt that this was a worthwhile modern interpretation of the vintage model, and others felt more of a connection to the vintage and didn't see the point of this modern version. The thing is, if you like vintage, then buy the vintage. This new model doesn't mean the vintage is going away. I kind of liken it to cars. Every once in a while, a car manufacturer will come out with a modern interpretation of a beloved vintage car. You have some folks who are going to embrace it and love it, and others who are very attached to the original and get defensive. They feel like something is encroaching on the legacy of what they love. They can feel a modern interpretation is more of an affront to humanity. It's a matter of personal taste, and it's okay to have a preference. In regard to the Esterbrook JR, it retails for $140 and can be found at a multitude of retailers. While I feel that's on the high end of the valuation of this pen, I don't feel that the price is out of line. I personally prefer larger pens as opposed to smaller pocket pens like the JR, but this one is nice. It is well built. I like the resin that they have chosen to use, and I think that it has enough nods to the original J to be a worthy modern successor. Thanks again go out to Kenro Industries for providing this pen on loan for review. Now it is time for some measurements, size comparisons. I'll show the difference between the vintage J and this modern JR and provide a writing sample. So here we go with some size comparisons for the Esterbrook JR. Here it is with a vintage Esterbrook J. And then here it is with a Sailor Pro Gear. And here it is with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. In regard to some other smaller pocket pens, here it is with a Kaweco Skyline Sport, a Stella 90S from Pilot, and here it is with an Aurora Optima. In regard to some uncapped comparisons, here it is with that Pro Gear, then here it is with the Pilot Stella 90S, and here it is with an original Esterbrook J. In regard to some comparisons to the original Esterbrook J, let's look at a couple of different comparisons. You can see how the finial is a little bit different with the black on the J. You can also see how the clip is different in length and how this clip on the vintage one has Esterbrook on the name. And also, if we look closely, you can see here that on the vintage, the lines go all the way down to the end of the clip, and on the modern, they stop just short of it. On the modern, there is a band with Esterbrook. The band on the vintage is not branded at all. And one of the biggest differences, as I mentioned before, is the vintage one is a lever filler, and then the modern one is the converter, the cartridge converter pen. So here we have the Esterbrook JR. This is a fine stainless steel nib, and the ink that I'm using today is Colorverse Cat. this is what the ink looks like. It's a nice darker blue that has some shimmer to it. It came in a pairing with Colorverse Schrodinger, so it was Schrodinger and Schrodinger's cat. If you care to see it, I do have a review of the Schrodinger ink on my channel as well. Here it is in comparison to the Wall Eversharp Everberry, as well as it's fairly similar to the Pelikan 4001 Royal Blue. This is what the bottle looks like. This is the smaller 15 milliliter bottle that comes with the larger bottle in the set. And you can see here, there's a little bit of shimmer here that hasn't been shaken up within the bottle. Okay, here we go with the rest of the writing sample. As I mentioned, this is a rather stiff nib. You're not going to get a lot of flexibility out of here. And that, as you can probably hear, that it sounds like there's a lot of feedback, and there is. I wouldn't describe it as being scratchy, even though it's a fine nib, and sometimes I find fine and extra fines to be a bit scratchy. But this one I find just to have a fair amount of feedback to it. The ink flow is decent on here, and in regard to reverse writing, it does okay, but it is rather scratchy doing reverse writing. And in regard to some fast writing, I feel it keeps up just fine. So there we have the Esterbrook JR. I think this is a very interesting addition to the marketplace. I think that folks that enjoy the vintage Esterbrooks will enjoy the modern interpretation, and even the folks that don't have a connection to the vintage will like this pen on its own. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, I totally spaced, so I had to come back and do this. I totally forgot that I was going to show you what I felt the interlocking E's were on this particular logo. I'm not sure what you came up with, but what I came up with is I think it's more like this is an E, and then this is an E mirrored. So it's kind of like that. And that's the mirrored E that ends up on here. That was my interpretation. If you came up with a different one, then by all means, let me know in the notes. Talk to you later. Bye.